My name is Elizabeth Kensington. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, people have described me with words like reliable, well-mannered, disciplined, the kind of person parents like to mention to their friends, the kind of daughter who turned out well. What they usually don't say is that I've always been quiet, not shy, just careful. I listen more than I speak. I notice patterns. I rarely interrupt. And because of that, people often mistake my silence for agreement, or worse, for emptiness. If you asked my parents to describe me, they would probably say I was easy, cooperative, low maintenance, the child who never caused trouble, the one who followed the plan. This story is not about villains. It's not about rage or revenge. And it's definitely not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, cinematic way. It's about something much slower, much quieter, and in the end, irreversible. I'm telling this story because for a long time, I thought my experience was normal. I thought everyone quietly traded pieces of themselves for family pride. I thought dreams were optional luxuries, something you outgrew if you were mature enough. This is the story of how my parents forced me into a career I never wanted, and more importantly, how I let it happen. I won't spoil the ending, but I will tell you this: nothing explosive happens here. There are no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no triumphant monologues. What happens instead is subtler, more unsettling, a psychological reversal that unfolds over years, not days. You'll hear about the expectations that were placed on me long before I understood I had a choice. You'll hear about the small, almost invisible moments where my own wants were gently, politely set aside. And you'll hear how being the good daughter slowly became a role I didn't know how to leave. This isn't a story about hating my parents. I loved them. In many ways, I still do. They believed they were doing what was best for me. And that's what makes this story harder to tell. Because sometimes the deepest sacrifices aren't demanded with cruelty. They're requested with pride. If you're expecting drama, you won't find it here. What you'll find instead is honesty, the kind that takes time to sit with, the kind that doesn't ask you to pick sides. I'm sharing this for anyone who has ever felt successful on paper and hollow inside, for anyone who followed the path they were given, only to realize quietly that it wasn't theirs. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever wondered who you might have been if you had disappointed someone sooner? For as long as I can remember, I was defined less by who I was and more by how useful I was to the picture my parents carried in their minds. I don't mean that cruelly. They never said it out loud. But it lived in the way conversations bent around me, never toward me. The way decisions were announced, not discussed. The way my reactions were watched, not to understand them, but to measure whether they aligned with expectation. To them, I was the capable one, the sensible daughter, the proof that their sacrifices had meant something. At family gatherings, relatives would smile and say, "Elizabeth has always known what she wanted," and my parents would nod proudly, as if that were a settled fact, as if wanting was something I had confirmed long ago and never revisited. I rarely corrected them, partly because it felt ungrateful, partly because I wasn't sure how. I learned early that my role was not to complicate things. My younger cousins were allowed to be confused, rebellious, and uncertain. I was the counterexample, the one held up gently but firmly as the standard. "Be more like Elizabeth," my aunt once told her son, right in front of me. I remember smiling politely, feeling something tighten in my chest and saying nothing. It wasn't my place to disrupt the moment. That was the pattern. At school, teachers praised my discipline. At home, my parents praised my consistency. No one asked what energized me or what drained me, or what I imagined doing if practicality weren't part of the equation. Those questions felt indulgent, almost rude. Dreams in my family were things you respected in theory but didn't organize your life around. My parents both came from modest backgrounds. They had climbed slowly, carefully, through education and reputation. Stability wasn't just a goal, it was a moral value, and I absorbed that without resistance. I admired them. I still do. So when conversations about my future began, soft at first, then increasingly precise, I listened. I nodded. I took notes. You're good with structure. You don't get distracted. You do well in a profession with clear rules. None of these statements was false. They were just incomplete. I remember once, around 16, filling out a career aptitude questionnaire at school. One of the questions asked what I enjoyed doing most in my free time. I hesitated longer than expected. The answer felt private, almost dangerous. I wrote something safe instead. That habit, choosing the safer answer, became second nature. By the time university applications came around, the path felt obvious. Not because it excited me, but because everyone else seemed relieved by it. Law-adjacent fields, corporate structures, predictable trajectories. When I mentioned cautiously that I enjoyed writing, or design, or anything without a clear ladder attached to it, my parents didn't shut me down. They did something subtler. They smiled kindly. They said, "That's a nice hobby." And then they redirected the conversation back to reality. I didn't feel oppressed. That's important to say. I felt guided, steered, protected from my own impractical instincts, and I cooperated fully because being seen as dependable felt like love, because disappointing them felt unthinkable, because at that stage of my life, I believed that visibility came with risk and invisibility came with approval. So I learned how to disappear inside expectations. I learned how to perform gratitude even when something inside me felt untouched. I learned how to sound confident about plans that weren't mine. I learned how to accept praise for choices I hadn't truly made. To them, I was successful before I had even begun. To them, I was calm, settled, unconflicted. And maybe that's the most important part. They never noticed that I was slowly becoming someone who existed almost entirely in relation to what others needed from me. Not unhappy, not dramatic, just quietly absent. At the time, I didn't have the language for that absence. I only knew that something essential was being postponed indefinitely, with the promise that I could return to it later. Later, I learned, is a very convenient word. The first time I realized something had been taken from me, it didn't feel dramatic enough to deserve attention. That's the strange thing about these moments. You don't recognize them as turning points until long after they've passed. At the time, it just felt like a mild adjustment, a reasonable compromise, the kind adults make all the time. I was 18, sitting at the small kitchen table in our Cambridge flat, papers spread neatly between us. University acceptance letters, course outlines, timetables printed in black ink that felt heavier than they looked. My father was explaining the long-term benefits of the program he preferred. Calmly, logically, he spoke the way he always did, like someone laying out facts, not opinions. "This will keep doors open," he said. "You can always specialize later." My mother nodded, already imagining the relief of certainty. To them, this wasn't pressure. It was guidance, protection against regret. I listened. I always listened. I had been accepted into 2 programs. One was the sensible choice. The other wasn't. It leaned toward creative disciplines, writing, analysis, interpretation. Less predictable, less respectable in their eyes, though they would never have used that word. When I mentioned the second offer, Carefully, my mother smiled in that way she had when she thought I was being idealistic. Elizabeth, you don't want to struggle unnecessarily, she said. You've worked too hard for that. She meant well, I knew that. They both did. And yet something in me tightened. Not painfully, just enough to notice. I remember tracing the edge of my acceptance letter with my finger, feeling the texture of the paper. I remember thinking, if I push back now, this will become a bigger conversation. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of destabilizing the image they had of me. So I didn't push. I said, you're probably right. I said, I can always write on the side. I said, this makes sense. And just like that, the decision was made. No argument, no raised voices, just a quiet closing of one door, while everyone else focused on how many remained open. That night, alone in my room, I stared at the ceiling longer than usual. I wasn't devastated. That would have felt excessive. I was subdued, as if I had agreed to store something important in a box and place it on a shelf labeled later. I told myself I was being mature. That was the lie I used often in those years. That maturity meant minimizing desire. What no one noticed was that this was the first time I had overridden my own preference to maintain harmony. And it worked. The household stayed peaceful. My parents were pleased. The future looked organized. Everyone won, except the part of me that had hoped, quietly, that someone would ask, what do you want? That question never came. At university, I adapted quickly. I always do. I learned the language, the expectations, the rhythms of the work. Professors liked me. Classmates relied on me. Group projects flowed smoothly when I was involved. On paper, I was thriving. But there were moments, small, easily dismissed moments, when I'd pass the building where creative departments worked late into the night. I'd hear laughter, animated debates, the messy energy of people deeply engaged in something they cared about. I would pause just for a second. Then I'd remind myself that enjoyment wasn't the metric. Stability was. I normalized that quiet ache. I told myself it was nostalgia or fear of the unknown. I learned how to look forward without enthusiasm and call it discipline. And because nothing visibly bad happened, no one questioned the choice. Not my parents, not my friends, not even me. But something had shifted. A boundary had been crossed, not by force, but by consent. The first small cut is always the easiest to justify. Once you accept the first compromise, the next ones arrive more easily. They don't announce themselves as losses. They present as refinements, adjustments, proof that you're learning how the world works. By my second year at university, I had become fluent in explaining my own life in ways that reassured other people. When relatives asked if I liked my course, I'd say, it suits me. When friends complained about pressure, I'd remind them that structure was comforting. I wasn't lying. I was translating. What I didn't say was that I had begun to feel interchangeable, like someone had copied me into a role designed for any competent, compliant person and pressed save. The subtle dismissals started to accumulate around that time. They weren't cruel. That's important. Cruelty would have been easier to identify, easier to resist. Instead, they came wrapped in reason. When I mentioned casually that I'd thought about taking an elective outside my department, something writing heavy, something exploratory, my father frowned slightly. Is that really necessary? He asked. You don't want to dilute your focus. Necessary. That word became a gatekeeper. My mother would add, you can always do that kind of thing after you're established. After, later, someday. I nodded. I always nodded. Each time I felt a small internal recoil, followed by immediate self-correction. They're just being practical. They know more than you. This is what support looks like. Disrespect, when it's polite, is easy to mislabel. At family dinners, conversations about my future took on a certain tone. My career path was discussed as a collective investment. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone felt entitled to weigh in. I became a topic, not a participant. When I tried to clarify gently that I wasn't sure I wanted to stay on the same trajectory long term, the room would quiet, not unkindly, uncomfortably. My uncle laughed once and said, "Don't overthink it, Liz. You're set. Some people would kill for your options." The message was clear. Questioning the path was indulgent, almost offensive. So I stopped questioning it out loud. What I didn't realize then was that my silence was being interpreted as confirmation. The quieter I became, the more certain everyone else felt. At university events, my parents introduced me with a practiced pride. They spoke about my discipline, my prospects, and my seriousness. I stood beside them smiling, feeling like a well-presented case study. No one noticed that I rarely spoke about myself unless prompted. No one noticed that my answers had become generic. No one noticed that enthusiasm had been replaced by competence. And why would they? Competence was what they valued. I told myself this was temporary, that once I reached a certain level of security, I'd reclaim the parts of myself I'd put on hold, that this was a strategic delay, not a surrender. That belief kept me going, but the pattern was set. Every time I deferred my own curiosity, it became easier to do it again. Every time someone dismissed a possibility for me, and I accepted their reasoning, I reinforced the idea that my instincts were unreliable. I began to edit myself preemptively. Before speaking, I'd run my thoughts through an internal filter. Is this practical? Will this worry them? Does this fit the version of me they're proud of? If the answer was no, I kept it to myself. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through force, but through repetition, through the steady erosion of self-trust. I still visited my parents regularly. We had pleasant conversations. They asked about my grades, my plans, and my internships. I delivered reassuring updates. They never asked how I felt, and I never offered, because feelings didn't seem relevant to the project of becoming someone respectable. By the time I graduated, the path ahead felt locked in, not because I had chosen it again, but because I had never chosen anything else. And here's the part that took me years to admit. I wasn't invisible because they ignored me. I was invisible because I had learned to present only what was acceptable to see. The disrespect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself as harm. It felt like efficiency, and I told myself that was enough. By the time I entered the workforce, the role had already been written. I didn't consciously agree to it. There was no moment where someone sat me down and said, "This is who you are now." It emerged naturally, the way habits do when they're rewarded often enough. I was the reliable one, the person who didn't complain, the person who handled complexity without visible stress, the person who made other people's lives easier simply by being present. In my first corporate role, that reputation formed quickly. I noticed inefficiencies others overlooked. I anticipated problems before they surfaced. I stayed late without being asked, not out of ambition, but because unfinished things bothered me. Managers appreciated me. Colleagues leaned on me. No one worried about me. At home, my parents relaxed. This to them was success, not flash, not fame, proof, evidence that their guidance had been correct. My mother would tell friends, "Elizabeth has always been very steady." My father would add, "She doesn't get distracted." They meant it as praise. What they didn't see was that steadiness had become a performance, that being undistracted required constant suppression, that I was channeling all of my attention outward toward systems, expectations, deliverables, because looking inward felt dangerous. I had learned that my value came from consistency. Whenever I hinted at uncertainty, nothing dramatic, just a comment about feeling restless or questioning long-term fit, the response was always the same. You're just tired. Everyone feels like that sometimes. You're doing so well. Don't sabotage yourself. Sabotage, another loaded word. It implied that wanting something different was an act of self-harm. So I stopped mentioning it. Instead, I leaned further into the role. I became indispensable in small, unglamorous ways. The person who remembered details. The one who followed through. The one you trusted with sensitive information. Because I never reacted emotional. That last part was especially true. I had learned how to keep my face neutral, how to absorb pressure without showing strain, how to respond calmly even when something inside me recoiled. People mistook that for strength, and in some ways it was. But it was also a cage built from praise. At family dinners, conversations about my career grew increasingly abstract. My parents spoke about my future as if it were already secure, already defined. Promotions were assumed. Stability was a given. There was no space left in the narrative for reinvention. When I tried once to articulate that I felt disconnected from my work, that it didn't feel meaningful to me, my father looked genuinely confused. "You've never been the type to need meaning," he said. "You've always been practical." That sentence stayed with me longer than he knew, not because it was cruel, but because it was definitive. It turned my adaptability into an identity. It reframed my compliance as preference. In that moment, I realized something unsettling. The version of me they believed in no longer included my inner life at all. I was a function, a trajectory, a success story. And success stories aren't supposed to hesitate. I began to understand that as long as I fulfilled the role, I would be rewarded with approval. And as long as I stayed quiet about the cost, no one would question the arrangement. So I stayed quiet. I told myself this was adulthood, that everyone trades something personal for something stable, that dissatisfaction was the price of reliability. But a part of me, small, persistent, kept track. I noticed how often my parents spoke about me rather than to me. I noticed how easily my silence was mistaken for contentment. It was noticed that my role was useful precisely because it required so little from anyone else. That part of me didn't protest. It observed. And observation, as I would later learn, is where change begins. The day something shifted didn't announce itself as important. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic realization that rearranged my life in an instant. It happened on an ordinary weekday, in the middle of an ordinary task, under fluorescent office lighting that made everything feel slightly unreal. I was reviewing a compliance report, one of dozens I'd handled that month, when I noticed a familiar sensation, the quiet numbness that had become my baseline. Not stress, not boredom, just distance, as if I were watching myself work from a few steps away. Normally, I ignored that feeling. I'd trained myself to. But that day, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I didn't. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If no one were watching, would I still be here? The answer came quickly, too quickly. No. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't painful, it was clear. And clarity can be more unsettling than despair. I sat there, hands folded, feeling the weight of that answer settle. It didn't accuse me. It didn't demand action. It simply existed, undeniable. For the rest of the day, I moved through my tasks with the same efficiency as always. I attended meetings. I nodded at the right moments. I delivered what was expected. But something fundamental had shifted internally. For the first time, I wasn't trying to justify my life to myself. That evening, I visited my parents for dinner. The timing was unremarkable. We ate familiar food and discussed familiar topics. My father talked about a colleague's promotion. My mother asked about my workload. I answered automatically. Then, almost without intending to, I said, I don't think I want to do this forever. The room didn't go silent. That would have signaled drama. Instead, the conversation gently rerouted around my statement, like water avoiding a stone. You're just in a phase, my mother said lightly. Everyone gets restless at your age, my father added. They weren't dismissive, they were reassuring. And that's when it happened. I felt nothing. No frustration, no urge to explain, no need to argue my case. Just a quiet recognition. They are not listening, and they don't need to. For the first time, that didn't feel like a failure on my part. It felt like information. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conversation, not with resentment, but with curiosity. I realized that I had been expecting something unreasonable for years, that the people who benefited most from my compliance would be the ones to validate my desire to change. Why would they? The system worked for them. That realization didn't make them villains. It made them human, and it made something else possible. I stopped seeing my silence as something imposed on me. I began to see it as something I had been choosing, out of habit, out of fear, out of a belief that harmony required self-erasure. That belief cracked that night, not loudly, not completely, just enough to let a new thought through. I don't need permission to reconsider my life. I didn't tell anyone about that shift. There was nothing to tell. From the outside, everything remained the same. I went to work, I visited my parents, I fulfilled my role. But internally, I stopped narrating my choices for an imagined audience. I stopped explaining myself in advance. I began to observe my life the way I observe systems at work, without emotion, without judgment, just attention. And in that attention, I noticed how much of my energy went into maintaining an image that no longer fit. How often my parents spoke with certainty about my future, unaware that their certainty rested on outdated information. For the first time, that didn't scare me. It grounded me, because clarity, once it arrives, doesn't demand action. It waits. After that day, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reflexive, an automatic response to keep things smooth. Now, it has become deliberate. Not strategic in the dramatic sense, but intentional. I stopped speaking simply to reassure others. I spoke only when it felt necessary. The difference was subtle. No one noticed. That, in itself, was revealing. At work, I continued to perform at the same level. If anything, I became more precise. When you stop seeking validation, your attention sharpens. You stop over-explaining. You stop preemptively apologizing. Managers interpreted this as confidence. At home, my parents took my quietness as stability. They liked that I didn't overthink things anymore. They liked that I seemed settled. I let them believe that. This wasn't deception. It was boundary setting without announcement. I began to understand something important. Silence is only weakness when it's unexamined. When chosen consciously, it becomes a form of control. I started listening differently. When my parents talked about my future, assumptions layered on assumptions, I didn't interrupt. I noted what they believed. I noted what they needed to feel secure. I also noted what they never asked. They didn't ask what fulfilled me. They didn't ask what I was learning. They didn't ask whether the version of success they imagined still matched who I was becoming. Their narrative had momentum. I had been fueling it for years. Now I stopped adding energy. Instead of correcting them, I observed. Instead of defending my choices, I let them sit with their own expectations. At work, I began documenting everything, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. I had always been detail-oriented. Now, that tendency had direction. I tracked projects, responsibilities, and dependencies. I noticed how often my role extended beyond my job description. I didn't complain. I didn't demand recognition. I took notes. There's a particular freedom that comes when you stop trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You conserve energy. You think long term. I also started paying attention to my own reactions. Which tasks drained me immediately? Which ones engaged me quietly? Which moments, rare as they were, made time feel less rigid? Those moments weren't accidents. They were data. At family gatherings, I became almost invisible again. But this time, by choice. I listened as relatives praised my parents for raising me right. I smiled when they spoke about my career as if it were a settled fact. I felt no urge to correct them because correction would have required me to argue within their framework, and I was no longer interested in that. This wasn't resentment, it was detachment. Detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity without urgency. My parents began to interpret my calm as maturity. They stopped worrying about me altogether. In their minds, I had arrived. That was the moment I knew something fundamental had shifted. When people stop monitoring you, they reveal how much they relied on your predictability. I didn't announce any plans. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I didn't seek allies. I prepared quietly. The silence that once kept me small now gave me room. And in that room, I began to understand the shape of my own leverage. Not power over others, but autonomy over myself. That distinction matters because this was never about proving my parents wrong. It was about no longer living as a supporting character in their idea of a successful life. Silence chosen carefully can be an exit strategy. They mistook it for compliance. I knew better. What my parents never noticed was how much I was learning simply by staying still. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still the dependable daughter with the sensible career. I still visited regularly. I still answered questions without friction. The story they told themselves about me remained intact. But beneath that surface, a different process was unfolding. I had always been observant. That trait had once made me compliant. Now, it made me precise. At work, I began to see the organization less as a place of employment and more as a system of incentives, blind spots, and dependencies. I mapped how decisions were actually made, not where authority sat on paper, but where momentum lived. I noticed which problems resurfaced repeatedly and who quietly absorbed them. Often that person was me. I didn't resent that anymore. I studied it. I documented workflows I had unofficially taken over years ago, tasks that were assumed, not assigned, institutional knowledge that existed only in my head. I realized how much continuity depended on my quiet presence. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because replacing me would require effort. That distinction mattered. Outside of work, I started reclaiming something else my parents never noticed: my attention. I stopped numbing it with busyness. I reduced social obligations that existed purely out of habit. I spent evenings reading, writing, thinking, not with a goal in mind, but with curiosity. I returned to the leather-bound notebook I had carried since university. For years, it had been mostly empty, its pages reserved for a version of myself I never quite became. Now I use it daily, not to plan an escape, to understand myself. I wrote without censorship, about what energized me, about what I avoided, about moments in my past when I had chosen safety over resonance, and why. Patterns emerged. I noticed how often my parents framed pride as protection, how they equated risk with recklessness, how their own unresolved fears had shaped the guidance they gave me. Understanding that didn't absolve them, but it contextualized everything. I also began quietly upskilling. Nothing dramatic, no announcements. I took online courses at night. I explored adjacent fields that valued the skills I already had, but applied them differently. Analysis, story, ethics, communication. These weren't random interests, they were intersections. I didn't tell my parents, not because I was hiding, but because sharing would have invited commentary. And I wasn't ready to filter my thinking through their expectations again. When you stop seeking approval, you start protecting momentum. At family gatherings, I noticed how little curiosity there was about my inner life. My parents spoke confidently about my future, unaware that they were describing a version of me that was slowly becoming obsolete. They didn't notice when I stopped asking for advice. They didn't notice when I stopped explaining my choices. They didn't notice when my silence stopped being anxious and started being grounded. That's the thing about long established roles. People stop checking whether they still fit. They also didn't notice how much emotional labor I had withdrawn. I no longer mediated conversations. I no longer softened disagreements. I let small tensions exist without resolving them. The family dynamic adjusted without comment. I wasn't missed in those roles as much as I expected. That was another piece of information. Slowly, carefully, I began to imagine a life that wasn't structured around earning peace. A life where my competence served my values, not someone else's narrative. This wasn't a rebellion, it was alignment. I didn't fantasize about dramatic exits or confrontations. I focused on feasibility, on sustainability, on timing. I understood something my younger self hadn't. Leaving quietly requires more preparation than leaving loudly. By the time my parents sensed that something was different, it was too late for commentary to matter. The groundwork was already laid. They never noticed because they didn't think they needed to, and that, in the end, was the quiet advantage. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I sat back and thought, this is it. What arrived instead was something calmer, heavier, and far more decisive. Certainty. It happened late one evening, alone in my flat, surrounded by open tabs on my laptop and pages from my notebook spread across the table. I had been cross-referencing numbers, timelines, requirements, things that, to anyone else, might have looked tedious. To me, they were grounding. I realized that what I had been doing for months wasn't drifting or searching. It was converging. Every skill I had refined in the career I hated, risk assessment, documentation, ethical reasoning, long-term planning, translated cleanly into a different path. Not a fantasy, a viable alternative. That was the moment I understood my leverage. Not over my parents, not over my employer, over the story. For years, the narrative had been simple. I stayed because leaving would be irresponsible, because I owed my parents stability, because deviation would undo everything they had worked for. But now that logic no longer held. I could leave without chaos. I could pivot without collapsing. I could redefine success without asking permission. The realization wasn't empowering in the way motivational stories describe. It was sobering. Because once you see a way out clearly, staying becomes a choice, and choices carry responsibility. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt accountable. I thought about my parents, about how much of their identity was invested in the idea that they had guided me correctly, about how my success validated their sacrifices. I understood that changing course would unsettle them, not because it would harm me, but because it would destabilize their sense of authorship over my life. That mattered, but it no longer outweighed everything else. I realized then that the real cost of staying wasn't dissatisfaction. It was erosion, a slow diminishing of self that no amount of external approval could compensate for. That night, I didn't make any announcements. I didn't tell friends. I didn't rehearse conversations. I did something quieter. I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. I will not negotiate my future to preserve someone else's comfort. Seeing it on paper made it real. From that point on, every action I took aligned with that sentence. I reviewed contracts more carefully. I structured my finances conservatively. I built buffers, not just monetary, but psychological. I stopped imagining how my parents would react and started focusing on what would make me steady regardless of their reaction. That distinction changed everything. I wasn't preparing to convince them. I was preparing to stand, and that required a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on being understood. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a subtle shift in how I carried myself. I wasn't colder, I was clearer. I didn't fill the silences anymore. I didn't rush to reassure. My parents sensed something, I think. They asked if work was stressful, if I were tired, if everything was all right. I said yes, because it was. The reveal wasn't something I shared with them. It was something I accepted privately. And once accepted, it couldn't be undone. Some truths don't need witnesses to be binding. They just need commitment. There's a moment after clarity arrives when inaction becomes its own decision. I reached that moment quietly. Nothing forced my hand. No crisis pushed me forward. That was what made it so stark. I could continue exactly as I was, comfortable, approved of, admired for my steadiness, and no one would question it. That option remained fully available. The other option required me to accept something I had spent most of my life avoiding, being misunderstood. I spent weeks considering both paths with the same analytical care I applied at work. I listed risks. I assessed timelines. I imagined consequences, not just logistical ones, but relational. If I stayed, my parents would remain proud. Our conversations would stay easy. I would never have to justify myself. But I also knew what staying meant now. I knew how the numbness would deepen, how each year would make leaving feel less reasonable, less forgivable, how my identity would calcify around a role I had outgrown. Leaving wouldn't be dramatic, but it would be definitive. I wouldn't be able to frame it as a phase or a temporary detour. It would require me to own the fact that I had chosen a path they hadn't designed. That was the irreversible part. I thought about how often my parents had said, "We just want what's best for you." I believed them, and I finally understood something about that phrase. What's best had always been defined by their fears, not my fulfillment. That didn't make them malicious. It made them limited. The decision wasn't about rejecting them. It was about no longer outsourcing my self-trust. One evening, after another polite dinner where my future was discussed as a settled fact, I walked home slowly, letting the cold air sharpen my thoughts. I realized that if I didn't act now, I would be teaching myself a final lesson, that insight without action is just another form of compliance. I didn't want to become someone who understood herself perfectly and still chose comfort over alignment. That night, I made the decision, not impulsively, not emotionally. I chose the path that required the least self-betrayal. The next morning, I began implementing changes that couldn't be undone with reassurance or delay. I formalized plans. I committed to timelines. I stopped hedging. I didn't tell my parents yet. There was no benefit in early disclosure. They would have tried to reason me back into place, not out of malice, but out of habit. This wasn't secrecy, it was sequencing. I needed to be standing on solid ground before inviting commentary. For the first time, I felt the weight of authorship. Every step forward was mine. No one had pushed me. No one could take credit. That was both terrifying and grounding. I noticed something else too. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply done living a life that required constant explanation to myself. The decision point isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet refusal to keep pretending that time will solve a problem that only choice can. Once made, the decision didn't demand urgency. It demanded consistency, and I was very good at that. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, my life looked exactly the same. I went to work, I met deadlines, I showed up to family dinners with the same calm demeanor that had reassured everyone for years. Internally, though, I shifted into a different mode. Execution. I didn't announce intentions. I didn't seek validation. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I understood now that movement attracts attention, but preparation thrives in quiet, so I moved in silence. The first thing I did was stabilize my foundations: finances, contracts, obligations. I reviewed everything with the same discipline I brought to compliance work. Nothing emotional, nothing rushed. I set aside savings with intent, not fear. I restructured my expenses to give myself more flexibility. I eliminated dependencies that tied my sense of security to external approval. This wasn't a rebellion, it was risk management. At work, I began transitioning responsibilities subtly. I trained colleagues without announcing why. I documented processes in neutral language. I made myself easier to replace, methodically, intentionally. That alone felt like reclaiming something. I wasn't sabotaging my role, I was completing it. My parents noticed nothing unusual. If anything, they seemed more relaxed than ever. I had become predictable again, safe. They spoke freely about my future, projects they assumed I'd take on, milestones they imagined I'd reach. I listened without correcting them. Not because I lacked courage, because their certainty no longer defined me. I had learned that there's a difference between secrecy and privacy. I wasn't hiding my life. I was protecting its direction until it could stand on its own. At night, I continued building the next chapter quietly, writing, research, conversations with people outside my parents' social and professional orbit. People who spoke in questions instead of assumptions. No one told me who I should be. They asked who I was. That contrast was striking. I didn't rush toward an exit. I waited until the timing felt clean, until my footing felt steady enough that doubt wouldn't send me retreating. Silence gave me leverage, not over others, but over momentum. No one tried to stop me because no one knew there was anything to stop. That's the advantage of being underestimated for so long. People don't look for movement where they assume there is none. When the final steps began to lock into place, I felt a quiet calm, not excitement, not relief, readiness. I wasn't leaving against anyone. I was leaving toward myself. And when the moment came to make things visible, there would be nothing to negotiate. Only facts. Only decisions already lived into. Silence had carried me this far. Soon it wouldn't be needed anymore. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, like a room cooling after the heat has been turned off. Subtle at first, easy to misinterpret. The first sign was confusion. At work, questions began to surface. Small ones, routine ones, things people had never needed to ask before because I had always handled them quietly, automatically. How do you usually do this part? Do you have a template for that? I answered calmly. I shared documentation, I stayed helpful. What I didn't do was rush in to fix things that weren't explicitly mine anymore. That restraint changed the atmosphere. Deadlines stretched slightly. Meetings grew longer. Decisions required more people. Nothing broke, but the ease was gone. People felt it before they understood it. At home, the shift was emotional rather than logistical. My parents noticed that I was less available. Not in time, but in energy. I still visited. I still listened, but I no longer absorbed their anxieties as my own. When my mother complained about extended family or worried aloud about appearances, I didn't immediately soothe her. I acknowledged, then let the concern rest where it belonged. She found that unsettling. You seem distant lately, she said once carefully. I smiled and said, I'm fine. And I was. The real consequence was that their assumptions started meeting resistance, not from me, but from reality. Plans they had casually attached to my future began to feel uncertain. They spoke about my next promotion as if it were imminent. I didn't confirm or deny. The silence they once found comforting now felt ambiguous. At work, my manager scheduled a meeting. He praised my performance, then asked, almost as an afterthought, about my long-term plans. For years, that question had been rhetorical. This time, it wasn't. I answered honestly, but selectively. I said I was exploring options, that I was thinking more intentionally about fit. He looked surprised, not threatened, just recalibrating. That recalibration rippled outward. The narrative that I was indefinitely stable began to wobble. At home, my parents began asking more questions, not about my feelings, about logistics. Are you happy where you are? Do you see yourself staying long term? They weren't prepared for non-committal answers. I could sense their unease. For the first time, the future they had pictured no longer felt guaranteed. They hadn't lost me, but they could feel me slipping out of reach of their expectations. And that created a quiet panic. They tried to restore normalcy by doubling down on reassurance, by reminding me of how well I was doing, by emphasizing how fortunate I was. I listened politely, but reassurance only works when the recipient is still seeking permission to stay. I wasn't. The consequences were not punitive. No one yelled, no bridges burned. But the equilibrium shifted. When you remove yourself from a role without announcing it, people feel the absence before they can name it. My parents felt it as uncertainty. My workplace felt it as friction. And I felt it as confirmation. This was working. Not in the sense of triumph, but in the sense of alignment between internal decision and external reality. For the first time, my life wasn't being held together by my silence. It was reorganizing itself around my choice. And once that process begins, it doesn't reverse quietly. By the time my parents realized something was truly changing, their instinct was to fix it, not aggressively, not manipulatively. The way people fix things when they believe the foundation is still negotiable, by adjusting tone, by offering reassurance, by subtly reminding you of who you've always been. The problem was that they were responding to a version of me that no longer existed. The first real moment of panic came disguised as concern. My mother invited me over just to talk. She cooked more than usual, asked more questions than usual. She lingered in the kitchen after dinner, wiping already clean counters, as if movement itself could delay what she sensed was coming. You've seemed unsettled lately, she said carefully. Is work too much? I told her work was fine. She frowned. Then what is it? For years, that question would have opened a door I rushed to close again. To protect her, to protect peace. This time, I didn't rush. I'm thinking about changing direction, I said. The word direction landed harder than I expected. My father leaned forward slightly. Changing how? I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted from emotional to logistical. They weren't asking what I wanted. They were trying to locate the problem. I explained calmly, not defensively. I didn't frame it as dissatisfaction or blame. I spoke in terms they respected: alignment, sustainability, long-term clarity. They listened, and then they responded with solutions, none of which addressed what I had actually said. You don't need to decide now. You've always done well where you are. Why throw away something solid? Each sentence was an attempt to restore the old equilibrium. I understood then that they weren't reacting to my uncertainty. They were reacting to their loss of certainty. My mother reached for the language that had always worked before. We just worry about you. We don't want you to regret anything. That was the moment it became clear it was too late, because I no longer trusted regret as my compass. I told them gently that I had already thought this through, that this wasn't impulsive, that I wasn't asking for advice. I was informing them of a decision in progress. That distinction unsettled them. My father grew quiet. My mother's eyes filled, not with anger, but confusion. "When did you start feeling this way?" she asked. I could have said years ago. I could have said when I was 18. Instead, I said, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm acting on it now." They tried again over the following weeks. Different approaches, softer voices, practical arguments, emotional appeals framed as concern. They reminded me of how much I'd achieved, how proud they were, how this wasn't like me. They were right. It wasn't, because the version of me they knew had been built to be agreeable. What they didn't understand and couldn't reverse was that my decision wasn't fueled by frustration. It was fueled by clarity. You can argue with anger. You can soothe doubt. You can't negotiate with someone who has already left internally. That's when panic sets in. Not loud, but persistent. A sense that something essential is slipping away, and no amount of reassurance will bring it back. They began to realize they were no longer part of the decision-making process, and that realization hurt them. I felt that. I didn't dismiss it, but I also didn't let it redirect me, because guilt only works when the person feeling it still believes they're doing something wrong. I didn't. By the time they understood that this wasn't a phase, the conditions that allowed them influence were gone. I was financially independent, professionally prepared, emotionally steady. There was nothing left to fix, only something to accept. And acceptance for them would take time. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a collision. It felt like two truths standing in the same room, no longer able to pretend they were the same. It happened on a quiet afternoon. No raised voices, no accusations, just the three of us sitting at the table where so many decisions about my life had once been made without me. My father spoke first. "We feel like we're losing you," he said. Not angrily, not manipulatively, just plain. I took a moment before responding, not to compose myself, but to choose accuracy over comfort. "You're not losing me," I said. "You're losing control over a version of me that no longer fits." That was the most direct I had ever been. My mother looked startled, then hurt. "We only ever wanted what was best for you." "I know," I said, "and I'm grateful for that. But what's best for me isn't something you can decide anymore." There was a long pause. This was the moment I had once imagined as explosive, the moment I'd avoided for years. And yet, sitting there, I felt calm, grounded, almost neutral, because I wasn't asking them to agree. I was stating reality. They tried briefly to reframe the conversation, to pull it back into familiar territory. "You've always been happy being stable," my father said. "You don't need to push yourself so hard," my mother added. I didn't contradict their point by point. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit the past. I said something simpler. "I've spent most of my life being who you needed me to be. That doesn't make you wrong, but it does mean I need to choose differently now." That sentence changed the tone of the room. It removed blame. It removed defensiveness. And it made the boundary unmistakable. They asked questions after that, fewer, but sharper, about logistics, about timing, about what this meant for the future. I answered what I could. I left the rest undefined. Not everything needs to be explained to be legitimate. There was no apology in my voice, no resentment either, just steadiness. I think that unsettled them more than anger would have, because anger invites argument. Calm ends it. At one point, my mother said quietly, "I wish you told us sooner." I looked at her and said honestly, "I wasn't ready then. I am now." That was as close as I came to revisiting the past. We sat in silence for a while after that, not hostile, just adjusting. They weren't pleased. They weren't reassured, but they understood. And understanding, even without agreement, is enough. When I left that afternoon, there was no dramatic goodbye, just a subdued hug, a sense that something had shifted permanently. I walked home feeling lighter, not because the relationship was suddenly easy, but because it was finally honest. I hadn't won anything. I had simply stopped losing myself. And that, I realized, was the only confrontation I had ever needed. Who I am now is not a reaction to who I was then. That distinction matters. For a long time, I worried that stepping away from the life my parents had designed would turn me into someone defined by opposition, someone always explaining, always resisting, always carrying the past forward like a counterweight. That didn't happen. What emerged instead was something quieter and more stable: authorship. My days are structured differently now. Not necessarily easier, but more intentional. The work I do engages the parts of me that once had to live on the margins. Analysis paired with creativity, structure in service of meaning rather than obligation. I still use the skills my old career gave me. I didn't discard that life. I integrated it. That's something people often misunderstand about change. They imagine it as rejection. For me, it was refinement. I no longer measure my success by how little trouble I cause. I measure it by coherence, by whether my internal and external lives align. That alignment has changed how I move through the world. I speak less, but with more precision. I agree less quickly, but more honestly. I don't rush to be understood. With my parents, the relationship is different, quieter, more careful. They still don't fully understand my choices. I no longer need them to. There are moments of awkwardness, pauses where old expectations surface and then dissolve. But there is also something new: respect, not enthusiastic approval, not pride as they once defined it. Respect for my steadiness. They see now that I didn't fall apart without their guidance, that I didn't spiral or retreat, that I became more myself, not less. And that realization, even if it remains unspoken, has shifted the balance between us. I no longer feel the need to manage their emotions. I listen, but I don't absorb. I care, but I don't contort. That freedom has been costly. Letting go of approval always is, but the cost of keeping it would have been higher. Internally, the change is even more pronounced. The numbness is gone. In its place is a quieter form of satisfaction, not constant happiness, but presence. I notice when I'm engaged. I notice when I'm tired for reasons that make sense. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. The leather-bound notebook I once carried as a symbol of postponed possibility is now simply a tool. I write in it often, but without urgency. I don't need to document my becoming anymore. I'm here. What surprises me most is how little resentment I carry. I thought there would be more. But resentment thrives in silence and inaction. Once I acted, it had nowhere to root. I don't regret the years I spent being compliant. They taught me discipline, patience, and precision. They showed me how systems work and how to exit them without burning everything down. I also don't romanticize suffering. If I could speak to my younger self, I wouldn't tell her to rebel sooner. I would tell her this: pay attention to what costs you energy to maintain. That's where the truth is. Who I am now isn't louder. Isn't it harder? Isn't more impressive on paper? But she is no longer absent, and that has made all the difference. There's a particular kind of story we're taught to admire: The dramatic break, the explosive confrontation, the moment when someone finally says everything they've been holding back and walks away transformed. This wasn't that story. What changed my life wasn't defiance, it was authorship. For a long time, I believed that being a good daughter meant being easy to live with, that love was proven through compliance, that if I stayed steady enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, everything would work out. And in many ways, it did, just not for me. What I've learned is that sacrifice doesn't always announce itself as loss. Sometimes it looks like success. Sometimes it's praised. Sometimes it's invisible, even to the person making it. Dreams don't always die in conflict. Often, they're postponed with good intentions until postponement becomes permanent. My parents weren't villains. They were people shaped by their own fears, their own definitions of safety, their own unresolved compromises. They believed they were protecting me from instability. What they couldn't protect me from was becoming a stranger to myself. The hardest part wasn't disappointing them. It was accepted that no amount of external approval could substitute for internal alignment. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about refusing to disappear. It's about understanding that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of power. That preparation doesn't need applause. The most irreversible changes often happen long before anyone else notices. If there's a moral here, it's not follow your dreams at all costs. It's this: don't outsource your sense of self to the people who benefit from your compliance. You can love your family and still choose differently. You can be grateful and still walk away from what no longer fits. You can change without turning your past into an enemy. And you don't need to explain your life to people who aren't living it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt successful on paper but absent inside, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever followed a path because it made everyone else feel safe? And if so, what would it look like to choose yourself, quietly, without asking for permission? Take your time with that question. I did.